Once upon a time, there lived two sisters who had lived like sworn enemies for over 10 years. Their names were Chisimdi and Kamsi, and they were identical twins who, despite being so identical, could not stand the sight of each other. Chisimdi was a well reserved and disciplined woman who built a successful career as an architect. Kamsi, her sister, was an adventurous, free spirited entrepreneur whose fortunes spanned across several successful businesses. People around often wondered what could have caused the rift between them, but the twins cared less about what people thought and lived their separate lives far away from each other. They had mastered the art of avoidance, separate cities, separate circles, separate lives. Their childhood bond had long faded, replaced by an unspoken bitterness that neither of them wished to confront. What they did not know was that fate had other plans in store for them. One morning, a lawyer reached out to both of them with urgent news. Their billionaire father had just passed away after a prolonged illness. His last wish was that after his burial, both of his daughters would return home and handle his estate together. Chisindi and her sister Kamsi had no choice but to face each other once again. They arrived at their father's mansion after the burial, and the air between them was thick with tension. The last time they had spoken to each other was over a decade ago, and even then, their conversation was far from peaceful. The lawyer explained to them that everything their father owned was theirs to share. However, there was one condition. Before any asset could be claimed or sold, the twins had to live together in the house for 3 months. Chisimdi was so horrified to hear this. This must be a joke, she said, as Kamsi folded her arms and exclaimed that she had no interest in an inheritance that would force her into captivity with her twin sister. Just as they both turned to leave, the lawyer said something that made them stop in their tracks. If you leave today, you will never have the opportunity of knowing who your real mother is. The twins, on hearing this, froze. They had lived all their lives believing that their mother was dead, and for the first time in years, they shared the same expression, which was one of shock. What do you mean, our real mother? Chisimdi asked, as her voice shook in disbelief. The lawyer sighed and adjusted his glasses. Your father left behind a letter explaining everything that happened. However, you only received the letter after completing the 3 months together in this house. Kamsi scoffed as she began to speak. So what? We are supposed to play happy sisters just to get some letter? The lawyer remained calm. The choice is yours, but if you leave now, you will forever live your life guessing. The weight of these words settled heavily between them. For as long as they could remember, their father had been reluctant to speak about their mother. Chisimdi clenched her fist. She had spent years building a life of discipline, logic, and certainty. But now, everything she thought she knew was crumbling before her eyes. Kamsi, on the other hand, was used to taking risks, but this was not business. It was family. And if there was one thing she had always secretly wanted, it was answers to her lingering questions. Kamsi turned to the lawyer and agreed. She informed him that she was only going to be there for 3 months and not a day more. Chisimdi too agreed to stay on the condition that they both live on different floors. That was how the two sworn enemies moved into their father's mansion, hoping to stay away from each other for the duration of their stay. Chisimdi moved into the first floor of their father's mansion, whilst Kamsi occupied the second floor. The first few days were unbearable as they avoided each other at all costs. Chisimdi woke up early, had her breakfast in silence and headed straight for work. Kamsi, on the other hand, spent most of her time in the mansion, making phone calls and working on her different businesses. They barely communicated as they kept their distance from each other. One evening, Chisimdi returned home from work to realize that her sister Kamsi was throwing a lavish party. She was so exhausted and looked forward to returning home to some calmness and serenity. However, her hope was dashed as Kamsi turned the mansion to a disco hall. The loud music echoed through the mansion, making it impossible for Chisimdi to ignore. Filled with so much rage, Chisimdi sent the housekeeper to go tell Kamsi to turn down the music. She sat there furious as she waited patiently for the music to be turned down. Minutes passed and the music remained as loud as ever. Filled with so much fury, Chisimdi stood up and followed the sound of the music. She arrived the grand hall on the second floor, filled with people who were dancing and laughing. Chisimdi angrily walked to the sound system and switched off the music. The entire place fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Kamsi, who was in the corner smoking and drinking, could not believe her eyes. She approached her sister angrily as she landed her a hot slap across her face. The next time you cross my path will be the last time that I would ever allow you to do so, she said to Chisimdi, who glared at her in shock as she watched Kamsi call her unprintable names. The guests all stood and watched as Kamsi ridiculed her twin sister in front of them all. They could not understand how a twin could do such to her own twin sister. Chisimdi, unwilling to endure the embarrassment, retired to her room in pain. Kamsi turned up the sound of the music once again, but the enthusiasm of the guests had already waned. The tension in the mansion escalated rapidly after that night. Chisimdi felt so humiliated and angry. She swore to herself that she would never let the event of that evening slide. If Kamsi wanted war, then Chisimdi was ready to match her trouble. She was so furious and thought of what to do. The next morning, she woke up very early and made her way to the driveway. Kamsi's prized possession, which was a custom-made sports car, was parked in its usual spot, gleaming under the early morning light. Chisimdi smiled to herself as she poured sugar into the fuel tank, knowing that it would ruin the car's engine completely. Satisfied, she dusted her hands and walked back into the mansion, eager to see her sister's reaction when she realizes what she had done to her favorite car. A few hours later, Kamsi's scream of rage echoed through the mansion. She stormed into the living room, where Chisimdi sat calmly as she typed on her laptop. "You did this, didn't you?" Kamsi said angrily as her hands shook with fury. Chisimdi looked up at her and denied knowing what she was talking about. Kamsi knew deep within her heart that her twin sister was lying. She vowed within herself to make her sister pay, and this time in the worst way possible. The next morning, Kamsi retaliated by hacking into Chisimdi's business emails and deleting important contracts. She watched with amusement as Chisimdi paced around in panic, trying to recover the documents. Chisimdi, of course, did not let it slide. She installed a Wi-Fi jammer in the house, cutting off all of Kamsi's internet access, which she knew was crucial for her business dealings. Just as Kamsi stood there furious, she heard the doorbell ring. She arrived the door and met a handsome young man who looked so pleased to see her. Kamsi had no idea who the man was, but the excitement in his eyes when he saw her convinced her that he had mistaken her for her twin sister Chisimdi. Kamsi decided to play along. She welcomed him into the house and quickly grabbed his hands. "I missed you," she said warmly, as the man confessed his love for her. Kamsi smiled slyly. She had just found the perfect way to get back at her twin sister. She held onto his hands tightly as she smiled and watched him proclaim his undying love for her. Kamsi stood there blushing. She knew that he was oblivious to the fact that she was not her sister Chisimdi. So, she pulled him to her room and made her way with him. Kamsi could not wait to see the look on her sister's face when she realizes what she had done. She sat up in bed the next morning, stretching lazily, as a wicked smile played on her lips. Ebuka, who was the man that she just slept with, was still fast asleep beside her. His arm was draped over her waist, oblivious to the chaos that was about to unfold. Kamsi then took a photo of them and sent to her sister Chisimdi, who stood in her room frozen to see Ebuka in bed with her twin sister. Chisimdi stood in her room, her phone shaking in her trembling hands as she stared at the picture on her screen. Taking a deep breath, she clenched her fist and stormed out of her room. Kamsi sat in the kitchen, sipping a glass of fresh juice, her legs crossed as she scrolled through her phone proudly. She was waiting for Chisimdi to explode. She could already imagine the rage on her sister's face When she finally comes down, Kamsi smirked. "Checkmate, dear sister," she whispered to herself as she laughed aloud. Just then, Chisimdi stormed into the kitchen. Kamsi barely had time to react before Chisimdi grabbed the glass from her hand and smashed it against the wall. The loud crash echoed through the entire mansion. Kamsi raised an eyebrow, feigning amusement. "Well, someone's dramatic this morning." Chisimdi's eyes burned with fury. "How could you?" Kamsi leaned back against the chair, stretching. "Oh, relax. It's just a man, Chisimdi. I thought you were too reserved to let emotions get in the way." Chisimdi took a step closer, her voice cold like ice. "You did this to hurt me?" Kamsi smiled. "And it worked, didn't it?" Chisimdi was breathing heavily now, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to slap Kamsi, to scream, to break something, but she couldn't give Kamsi the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. Instead, she took a deep breath and began to laugh. Kamsi, shocked to see her laughing, asked what was funny. "Why are you laughing?" she asked Chisimdi, who revealed to her that she was a fool. "You just played yourself, dear sister, by sleeping with my driver," she said to Kamsi, who could not believe her ears. "You thought I would be so foolish as to allow my fiancé to visit me in the house knowing how vile you are? I played you at your own game, sis, and hope you enjoyed your time with my driver. You can as well marry him," Chisimdi said to Kamsi as she let out a very loud laughter. Kamsi's smirk vanished. Her entire body stiffened as the weight of Chisimdi's words sank in. "What? What did you just say?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Chisimdi tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. "Oh, you heard me. Ebuka is not my fiancé, as you assumed. He is my driver." Kamsi's heart pounded violently against her chest as she called her sister a bloody liar. Chisimdi laughed, shaking her head. "Oh, poor Kamsi. You thought you had finally won, didn't you? You thought you could break me. But guess what? You played yourself. You let your hatred for me blind you into falling cheap for my driver." Kamsi's hands clenched into fists. The humiliation burned through her like acid. "No, this has to be a joke. You're making this up." Chisimdi stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Call him. Ask him yourself. Better still, go outside and look in my car. He's sitting there, waiting to drive me around town." Kamsi's breath hitched as she realized that truly, Ebuka was her sister's driver. Her entire body trembled as a storm of rage, shame and fury surged through her veins. She had lost. She had been played. She had built her entire revenge on nothing. Her face contorted with anger as her breath came out in sharp, ragged bursts. "You bitch!" she screamed as she grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter and lunged forward. The blade plunged into Chisimdi's stomach as blood trickled down to the floor. Chisimdi stumbled back, her eyes wide in shock as she clutched her abdomen. She looked down as her fingers trembled over the handle of the knife, which was now lodged deep inside her stomach. Kamsi froze as her heart began to race. She watched her sister stagger to the ground as she called out her name and collapsed to the floor unconscious. Kamsi was so petrified. The reality of what she had done hit her like a rock as she rushed to her sister's side and began to cry. With shaking hands, Kamsi pressed down on the wound as tears poured down her face. "Stay with me," she whispered frantically as she pleaded for her sister not to die. "Please don't die," she said as she yelled out continuously for help. Ebuka rushed into the kitchen and was confronted by the horrific sight. He rushed his madam to the hospital and the doctors immediately swung into action to save her life. Hours went by and Kamsi could not forgive herself for what she had done. Killing her twin sister was not something she had ever envisioned, but life had dealt badly with them. Kamsi sat in the cold waiting room, her hands covered in dried blood. Her heart raced as her mind spun like a carousel. For years, she had told herself that she hated her twin sister Chisimdi, that she despised her with every fiber of her being. But in that moment, as she sat there, waiting to hear whether her sister would live or die, she realized that she had never hated her at all. She had only hated what Chisimdi did to her over 12 years ago. They were only 16. young, naive, and full of love for each other. But then, everything changed. The twins had gone to church for night vigil. The pastor, who was a young man, had requested for them to help him clean the parish office before the vigil started. Just as they were cleaning, the pastor pointed his finger at Kamsi, saying that a dark spirit had possessed her. During that time, Kamsi was so rebellious and stubborn. She would do things that she was asked not to do, and this made people wonder if truly she was possessed. The pastor then ordered her to lie on the floor as he climbed on top of her, claiming to be performing a deliverance. Kamsi screamed at the top of her voice, pleading with her sister to save her, but Chisimdi stood there and watched as the pastor pinned Kamsi to the ground, chanting prayers while staring at her dress. Kamsi struggled, kicked, screamed, but the pastor's grip was firm. Chisimdi, help me! She had screamed repeatedly, but Chisimdi stood there frozen, paralyzed by fear. Her eyes darted between Kamsi and the pastor, uncertain. The authority of the church, the fear of questioning a man of God silenced her. Kamsi had fought alone that night. She had used every ounce of her strength to break free and run. And when she finally turned back to look at her sister, expecting her to follow, Chisimdi stood there in the arms of the same pastor who thanked her for a job well done. Kamsi could not believe her ears. She could not believe that her twin sister could do such a thing to her. Her world shattered as she sat in the hospital, her sister's blood still drying on her hands. Just as she sat there broken, the nurse walked in to reveal to her that her sister was stable. She would like to see you now, the nurse said to Kamsi, who walked into the hospital ward to see her sister. Kamsi sat next to her sister, and for the first time, she was eager to hear what her sister had to say. Chisimdi began to speak. She first started by apologizing to Kamsi for that fateful night as she narrated the entire story to her. For all these years, Kamsi had spent years believing that Chisimdi had betrayed her in the worst way possible. That night at the church had haunted her for years, twisting her heart into a place of darkness. She had convinced herself that Chisimdi had stood by and let the pastor assault her. In fact, that Chisimdi was a willing participant in the assault, and for that, she had spent 12 long years hating her sister. But what she did not know was that everything was not as it seemed. Chisimdi was not an accomplice as Kamsi had thought. She was in fact a victim who feared for her dear life. The pastor, a few days before the incident, had shown her a mirror which he claimed could end her life. He spoke into the mirror in her presence, calling Kamsi's name repeatedly, and Chisimdi was so terrified to see Kamsi appear on the mirror. He threatened her, saying that if she failed to bring Kamsi to him, he would kill them both, and Chisimdi, filled with terror, brought her sister to him. She stood there frozen that night, not out of betrayal, but out of overwhelming fear for both of their lives. But Kamsi gave her no room to explain. The pain and bitterness that had torn the twins apart for 12 years was rooted in fear, manipulation, and a misunderstanding that had festered into full-blown hatred. Kamsi sat frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared at her sister, unable to believe what she had just heard. For 12 years, she had carried so much hatred, believing that Chisimdi had betrayed her in the worst way possible. But now, everything she had believed crumbled before her like a pack of cards. Tears filled her eyes as she asked Chisimdi why she never told her about it. Chisimdi sighed, wincing in pain as she adjusted herself on the hospital bed. I tried, Kamsi. I tried so many times, but you never gave me a chance. You looked at me with so much anger in your eyes, so I thought that maybe you were better off believing that I was the villain. Kamsi shook her head as tears poured down her cheeks. I was so wrong, Chisimdi. I should have listened. I should have asked. She reached for Chisimdi's hand, gripping it tightly. I wasted 12 years hating you for something you did not even do. Chisimdi squeezed her hand weakly. We both lost 12 years, Kamsi, but we don't have to lose anymore. Kamsi sobbed as she held onto her sister's hand, regret tearing through her. I stabbed you, Chisimdi. I almost killed you. How do I live with that? Chisimdi smiled weakly. You live by making it right, We start over Kamsi as sisters, as twins. For the first time in years, the twins held each other, their hearts finally unburdened. The weight of the past no longer mattered as they agreed to leave the past behind. The 3 months finally came to an end, and the lawyer convened a meeting where the long awaited letter from their father was finally revealed. Chisimdi and Kamsi sat side by side in the lawyer's office, their fingers intertwined. It was a stark contrast to the first day that they had walked into the mansion with bitterness and resentment in their hearts. Now, after everything they had been through, they were ready to face the truth together. The lawyer cleared his throat and unfolded the letter. My dear daughters, if you are reading this, it means you have spent 3 months together in our home. This is all I ever wanted, to give you a chance to find your way back to each other. I know that I failed you both in many ways, especially when it came to brokering peace between you two. The truth is that your mother is dead, and everything you ever heard about her is true. I only used her as a bait to make you two stay in the mansion for these 3 months. Chisimdi and Kamsi sat in stunned silence, their fingers tightening around each other's hands. They had endured so much, hoping to find answers about their mother, only to realize that their father had manipulated them into reconciliation. The lawyer continued reading. I knew that if I told you the truth, you would have walked away without ever trying to mend your broken bond. But I also knew that deep inside, you both still loved each other, even if pride and pain had blinded you. I could not bear to die, knowing that my daughters, the two people I love most, would live the rest of their lives as enemies. Chisimdi exhaled sharply, shaking her head. So it was all a lie? She whispered. Kamsi, still processing the revelation, clenched her fist. He tricked us? Her voice was laced with disbelief. The lawyer sighed. Your father knew this was the only way to bring you back together. He regretted not intervening earlier and wanted to give you one last chance at reconciliation. Kamsi sat back in her chair, the events of the last 3 months replaying in her mind. Every fight, every wound, every moment of reconciliation had all led to this very moment, and yet, despite the deception, something inside her had changed. Chisimdi turned to her and began to speak. Kamsi, I know that you are angry, but look at us. If not for this, would we ever have spoken again? Kamsi opened her mouth to argue, but the words did not come, because the truth was, she had spent so long hating Chisimdi that she had forgotten what it was like to have a sister. And in the last few weeks, despite all the pain, she had felt something she hadn't felt in years, the love of family. She swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. Maybe he was right, she admitted. Maybe we needed this. The lawyer handed them another document. Your father has split the estate evenly between you two. He wanted you to build something together, if you choose to, or you can go your separate ways. But at least now, you will do so without hatred. Chisimdi and Kamsi exchanged a look. For the first time in over a decade, they saw each other, not as rivals, not as enemies, but as sisters. They had lost 12 years, but they still had a lifetime ahead of them and decided to build together. This time, they decided to walk it together as sisters, as family, as two halves of a whole that had been broken for far too long. This was how the twins found their way back to each other and lived the remaining of their life in peace. The lesson to be learned from this story is that everything is not as it seems. In life, do not be too quick to jump into conclusions, as you may end up holding on to pain and resentment for something that was never real to begin with. Always learn to communicate, as lack of communication can lead to unnecessary conflict. I hope you enjoyed the story.